Hey folks, welcome to a special episode of the Kolchak Tapes. Yes, we were back and we were talking to Paul Terry. He is the author of quite a lot of things. If you want to see all of his work, go over to paulterryprojects.com. Paul has recently written a Kolchak series of short stories. They have been collected in a volume called Kolchak, the Night Stalker, Haunted and Hunted. It is a fantastic book. I really enjoyed reading this one. I was just so glad after all this time to finally dive into the world of Kolchak literature other than the stuff that Jeff Rice wrote. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy this episode. And if you enjoyed Carl Kolchak and the Night Stalker, definitely go back and listen to the rest of our episodes over at kolchaktapes.com. Thank you so much for coming on. I'm really excited to talk to you about your Kolchak work and other things. I would love to know a little bit more about you and your background, because you do a lot of things. I'm not sure if you're aware of that.
I tend to tell people when they ask that question, I tend to say, I like making things. I like telling stories. I guess that sort of covers the breadth of it all, but it feels normal to me because I've always done it since being a kid at school. I've always enjoyed doing something that's supposed to be on the curriculum, and then outside of studying or writing essays, making music and so forth. And so going through into adulthood, I think I just thought that was normal. So we just kept multitasking.
Your stuff usually relies on other sources in order to have that platform. But then I think you've also done original fiction as well. Is that correct?
Yeah. The Kolchak book, the Haunted and Hunted sort of short story collection, that's my first prose fiction proper, if you like. But I've always wanted to dabble into that world and do more of that stuff. And that pulls from many different things. From, as I say, when you're a kid, you're always writing stories and being creative. And then going through to doing more creative writing with collaborations in different mediums. So filmmaking, being involved as a producer, working with directors on their scripts and things, and then co-writing on some of those projects. But you're right, yes, a lot of my other books and writing work was more in the sort of making of space, or was an editor, which I was for a long time. You're editing other people's work and you're figuring out your own sort of like voice of storytelling and how you like to report information. And so yeah, I think it's one of those things where, and I always say this to young writers, write everything. I've written books that are tailored for kids, top 10 books, kind of things like that, as well as making of books about film and TV shows that cover different mediums. So things like Lost, things that are more sort of horror and comedy like Sleepy Hollow, or thrillers like The Blacklist. I tended to say yes to a lot of projects and then worry about how to do it afterwards. That's it. I think that's how I like to work in the creative arts, that you go, yeah, sure, yeah, I'd love to do that. And then you hang up and go, how will that work? But I think definitely a big influence on pitching even these stories for Kolchak. Obviously, I loved the show when I saw the reruns in the UK in the 90s. But I had been writing very intensely in character voices for the X-Files book that I did with Abrams, the first one, the official archive. And so X-Files is my favorite show of all time. And so it was a dream project to pitch. What that did was actually get me, back to school and really figuring out what are the rhythms, how does Mulder speak, how does Scully speak, how is that different, how would they speak in an official report. And so I think years of doing that, studying those patterns, just put me in the right headspace, as well as other previous projects, to say, you know what, I've been developing, I guess off camera is the phrase, away from the official career, my own IP, my own sort of fiction ideas. And so the Kolchak book felt like a great bridger, because it is a licensed book, it is a licensed character, but it was an opportunity to say, as a fan, what other adventures, what other cases could Carl Kolchak find himself falling into as he does?
And you talked about the voice of Mulder and Scully, but the voice of Kolchak is so distinct, and you get that perfectly. You nail that voice. I can hear Darren McGavin in my head.
Oh, thank you. That's the greatest review. That's, as long as someone thinks that, who loves the show, that means a lot to me. So thank you. I did work very hard on that.
I'm curious, what was the secret of unlocking Kolchak? What methodology did you use to bring him back to the page?
the similar process to when I did the X-Files books. It's really, you're rewatching the episodes and you're writing notes constantly. And I describe it as you're watching or you're rewatching things through a completely different lens. So when you're rewatching a show or a film that you love and you're just enjoying it for what it is, or when you're doing it professionally for this particular task, it's really, I love sound, I love language. So I'm really aware of trying to drill into those things. And it's really just taking copious notes. It's really just figuring out. There's lots of catchphrases that he comes up with, of course, and Darren McGavin's Kolchak, it's like the actor and the written character just become one, don't they? You can't imagine anyone else being Kolchak. And so it's terrifying when you give yourself that chance to do it. But it's a good fear, I think, because you really feel like you have to honor that character. You can't mess it up. You have to actually get it right. But yes, lots of note taking. I tend to really drill into the kind of catchphrases, the way that he talks in loops, the way he drills things out, like he says strike one, strike two, or he says item and then does translation. And that gives you a kind of foundation of what things he likes to say. But then I was really drilling hard into, he's very economical with language. He's very specific. He's a great reporter. But if he was a writer, if he was a novelist, he'd be an amazing writer because he has great visual language. And he sees things as they are and just calls them out in a almost poetic way sometimes. And within that, there's a sort of, as he calls things as what they are, if something's frightening or there's a lot of tension, he likes to build that drama and call it for what it is. But at the same time, there's that wit, there's that swagger to how he talks. It's a big balancing act, and these things take a while, and you start throwing down ideas about how he would craft something. But I really love the first person perspective for this style. It feels very like hard-boiled, very detective thing. And for me, that just felt like a real treat to go, oh, okay, how do we keep that really present? How do we keep that energy through short stories? And I've always loved the short story format and short film format because you have to do a lot in a short period of time. And I think for a Kolchak case, it's perfect because that also was in my mind, that rewatching the episodes, the movies, of course, as well, but watching the episodes, you get a sense of time being quite compressed and quite kinetic. And that because there's terrible things happening, and Carl Kolchak wants to solve it and stop them. And so that was a big influence as well. I think a couple of my stories take place over quite a narrow period of time. But I think that's an advantage for this kind of story. I think that, and it's just a personal preference. I know other writers have done very different approaches to Kolchak that have been wonderful. But for me, how I like to write and my love of horror and tension and drama and mystery especially, I think when you have a mystery you're trying to lay out to the audience that's in the horror space that you want them to lean in and try and solve with you, it's more powerful to keep it a little bit more condensed in the time frame.
The other thing I was going to say was it's not shtick at all. It does feel like Carl. And then, yeah, not only are you capturing the characters, but then putting them in these situations, them like Carl and Vincenzo as well, because you also capture Vincenzo's voice very well. But to then put them in these new scenarios that we've not seen them in before, where it's new ghost stories, new spook stories, new creatures that they're investigating, that's a whole other challenge to this. And I commend you. All of these stories were very compelling.
Oh, thank you so much. Vincenzo, I think what helps a lot is that the performances and the writing on the show is so strong. As you say, Tony Vincenzo is just, he's indelible. He's just there. Again, rewatching the episodes for Carl's voice, I, of course, was like, you can't have these stories without Vincenzo being a presence. I wanted to modulate how much he's a presence in the stories because it's like seasoning, isn't it? You got to get the seasoning just right. You don't want to overdo things. And the same with Emily and Ronald. They appear a couple of times, but I'd love to hear that. I'd love to hear that you feel that way about that it's not shtick. And for me, as a fan and as a writer, whenever there's a temptation to do sort of Easter egg style things, I'm terrified of ever drifting into the sort of member berries. Oh, look, we're ticking off things and we're making the fans cheer and go, hooray, that's a good reference. I always wanted any kind of Easter egg to be very organic and very natural so that it really is about the characters driving the story forward, or it's just integral to the story. And so that was another guardrail I put on myself. I was like, don't get tempted by doing too many things. Just do something subtle that feels like it fuels it. And Vincenzo, especially with the book starts with the haunted airport story, just the idea of what would that odd couple be like coming back from something that one person with Vincenzo thought was incredibly important, and the other being Carl being like, can I just go home? I don't want to.
How did this project come to you?
I like to give myself crazy challenges. I had a concept for a short, which actually was the last short of the story, The Promises, the one set in Paris, in France. And the kernel idea for that story goes back almost a decade, where I was actually in Paris. It was in 2013 with two dear friends, and we were in Notre Dame, and we scaled the staircase as described in the story. And just those gargoyles are incredible. When you see photographs of them, but seeing them up close, they're so eerie, they're so strange. Even the fact they were created at all is so odd. And a story idea was just stuck in my head since that trip. Was just, there's all these signs around anything about museums which say, do not touch this piece of artwork, do not touch this because they're ancient. And I thought, what would happen if you did? As in, could something quasi-supernatural happen if you broke the rules and you did actually touch a gargoyle? So the story idea for that, what goes way back, so 2013. And then as story ideas do, they tend to linger and come and go in your head. And then I think I was just rewatching some Kolchak and was thinking about this specific story in the context of maybe making it a short story that was nothing to do with Kolchak. And then rewatching Kolchak, it just felt, oh my goodness, it should be a Kolchak tale, because it's almost an impossible mystery that I had in my head. What is happening? How do you solve this? He's the guy. He's a very good reporter. He's very observant. He'll crack the case. And I pitched it to Moonstone, who had the license for Kolchak at the time. And the response I got was, yes, it's a short story. We don't tend to just publish individual short stories. We tend to do them as collections. And again, me being me, I thought, why don't I reply to the email and say, if I did you 4 more stories, would that constitute enough word count stories for a collection? And the answer was, yeah, give me some other log lines for stories. And then again, you see this pattern. I tend to say yes to things and then worry later about how to. I like the challenge. I pitched 4 other stories as log lines once I'd figured out the kind of range of supernatural stories that I wanted to write about. And based on those log lines, the editor-publisher at Moonstone said yes. And I was away with the races last year, and they came together really quickly. I think there was something, I was very excited about doing them. And I think that also fuels creativity when you're really inside the head of a character. And so I really dug back into those rewatches and was really fleshing out. I really wanted these 5 stories to exist almost. I think it's an echo of when I do my music projects. So I really get obsessed with track listing and how music flows between tracks. And so with this book, I wanted to make sure that the short stories, that was the order that they worked. If you remix the order, it wouldn't quite feel as good. And so there is a specific flow to those stories. And as you say, the kind of monsters or supernatural qualities or whatever it is that he encounters that moves through those stories. But yeah, it's one of those cases of almost a cold call, I guess, in a kind of Kolchak way, just saying, hey, editor, I've got an idea. Do you want to print this? And thankfully it worked out.
It's interesting because not only are you Carl inside of the head of Carl Kolchak, but then you're also God. And you're the one who's setting up these situations. You're the one who's throwing these blockers in front of Carl. So when you are doing this, do you have the whole thing planned out, or do you just see how Carl moves through this world?
It's definitely the latter. It's definitely character first. I have like a kernel about, I like to give any creative story I'm working on that's original. I like to think about a problem that's insurmountable, a mystery that's impossible, and then think about how would the character approach the first encounter with said mystery, with said problem. And yeah, you're absolutely right. The character of Carl Kolchak and then the other characters that he encounters, they almost, writers write in very different ways, I know, but the way I tend to like writing is I let the Carl voice lead the whole story. And so when you're reading these stories, when he encounters someone else, a new character, whatever it is, or decides to do something, I like to frame it under the auspices of that's what Carl Kolchak would do in that moment. And then this happens, and then if there's a blackout or this thing happens, how would then he react? And then how does that inform how the story moves forward? I love the mystery genre. I love the horror genre a lot, but I think that as we all do as fans, sometimes you can see the tent pole, or you can see the structure if it's story first. If it's these characters are just drifting through a story to get to a twist reveal or whatever it is. So I really wanted to make sure that it's character first all the way. And hopefully when people read these stories, they'll see that it's not always the same outcome. It's not always, and that's also something that I wanted to break away from the show. That there is in some episodes a similar structure to how he escapes or solves the problem, which is indicative of that genre. But when you have an opportunity to write new short stories with this character you love, I wanted to break the rules a little bit. And like you said, I was excited to put him in situations that in some respects might feel familiar to fans of the show and the character, but in other respects may feel like, I've never actually thought about Carl being in that situation. How would he get out of it? And honestly, that's what I asked myself. If you have Carl break down in the middle of nowhere and something terrifying starts happening, how does he deal with it where there's no one else to help him? So that kind of idea.
I noticed of course, the settings of the stories are very important, at least for me, trying to figure out where Carl is at in his career at this point. How important was setting for you, and especially time period, because that has to be another challenge for you?
Yes, that was actually a really interesting discussion with Moonstone Books because, again, when you're dabbling in the world of a licensed character, you are told a lot of things that you wouldn't know as a fan. And so I learned that in the 90s, when Jeff Rice was still around, the creator of Kolchak, of course, Jeff Rice, the genius, was with Mark Dawidziak, who was a writer and editor of many books and the Kolchak phenomenon mythology. They collaborated on this concept that basically after the end of the TV series, they did move to Hollywood. They moved to this thing called Hollywood Dispatch, and the crew essentially all moved there. And the rules got really set in terms of the licensed comic books and prose that happened from the sort of late 90s onwards, I think it was. And so again, I didn't know that. But it was incredibly fortuitous because I live in Los Angeles. And so hearing that, oh, okay, the Hollywood Dispatch, oh, this is exciting, because to be honest, that was a huge influence. Just knowing that information and that you had to frame things around that location and you couldn't riff on flashbacks to Chicago or whatever. It was all about the here and now in the Hollywood Dispatch was great because I've been to Catalina Island a bunch of times. It's a very evocative, inspiring place for stories anyway. I'm fascinated by the UFO phenomenon. I know there are sightings around Catalina. So that idea was like, okay, we should really dabble in some way in that territory. But then just thinking about different areas that are not too far from LA that could be conceivable, the fans would think, yeah, that works if there's something that's Fresno based, or even the Lake Tahoe story. It's a long drive, but it's not like a 5-day drive. So for me, it was looking at the map, it was thinking about locales, thinking about environments in terms of an isolation of environments or like an expansive, beautiful setting. I really wanted to mix things up a lot. And in terms of throwing Kolchak into situations, as we said, that he was dead set on he was going to solve this or get out of this, but maybe he hadn't really encountered this kind of thing before. And in that respect with monsters, I love that the show tackled a lot of classic monsters or riffs on classic monsters and mythology. And it was another challenge that I really wanted to rise to, which was, okay, we'll do some kind of haunting thing that's obviously related to a ghost in some respect. But I wanted to challenge myself as well and riff on new mythologies. I wanted to come up with, there's a phrase that came, I think it was in the TV show Fringe, and I think it was also then adopted by the TV show Sleepy Hollow, but this phrase called twistery, where they take actual history and they just bend it slightly. So that I love this concept, especially with Kolchak's stories, because he's a reporter, that the reader is thinking as they're reading it, I'm being told something historical, but is this completely real or is it completely fictional or somewhere in between? And so I love that. As a writer, I love doing that kind of research and just folding things on top of one another. That is true of all the stories. There are things that are absolutely true and things that are absolutely, a question mark behind. And there are things that are completely invented, but I'm not going to tell you. I'm not going to ruin the magic trick and tell you how those things fold out. But in terms of the period, you're right. That was a real challenge because I was thinking about if it's the 90s onwards, he's in Hollywood Dispatch, he's a lot older. And it was another rule I was told by Moonstone, which is a terrific rule, which is we never specify the year. You can specify calendar dates with days and months, whatever, but we basically act like it's the present, in quotes. It's just happening. And as a fan, I wanted to keep that 70s vibe in the stories, that things feel like they are that period. I absolutely didn't want to go near anything that would technologically not fit in that space, but just make sure the rules of the story feel like, for me, I just wanted to do a great companion to the vibe of the TV show and the movie. So I wasn't interested in even leaning near the sort of late 70s or early 80s ideas. It was just, this is just Kolchak's world and we'll live in that.
Yeah, I can't see Kolchak using a computer. I can't see him Googling. I can't see him using a cell phone. That would just be wrong. If he sends a text to Tony, no.
And honestly, if I'd have been told that was the rule, I don't think I would have been as take on the project, because you think, I want to stay in that analog space. And I love the idea of him finding a payphone or asking to use the phone at a motel, whatever it is. It just feels, that's the character, isn't it? Like you say, it just doesn't really fit.
Those were the struggles he had to go through. Just finding a pencil, his notebook, the tape recorder. Even though you don't think of them as trappings of Kolchak, they are trappings of Kolchak. The time period is a essential part of them. And I think that's probably where the newer one got into trouble sometimes.
Yes, I think, it was, I think I did see a couple of the episodes of the new one, but I think it was so different that it almost, if you joined the show 10 minutes in and hadn't seen the opening or hadn't heard the character names, I think you'd be forgiven for thinking it was a completely different remix or approach of new characters, which I guess that was their idea and their approach. But like you say, there's something about those challenges which he faced as a reporter, that it's not that no one believed him, it's the fact that there were so many other things that he had to deal with on a minute by minute basis, let alone the overall arching of, can we stop this monster killing people?
I like too that one of your challenges wasn't necessarily there, which is budget. If this is a Carl Kolchak story, you can take him to Paris. You don't have to worry about what are the production costs in order to get Darren McGavin in front of the Eiffel Tower.
Yes, absolutely. That story was really fun in that respect, because I had been to Paris, but again, some of the imagery of Paris is so evocative of, literally that story was the most fun in terms of locations, because you get maps out, you literally bring maps up, and I'm figuring out the real hotel where he's staying. How does that inform the story? Like, how far is that away from Notre Dame? Could something conceivably have happened between those two events? Where would other people he encounters, where would they live? How does that inform the story? So you start looking up weather reports from some certain month things. So you really, as you say, without a budget, you can really go to town in terms of short story and just have him encounter things that would be a lot more expensive to put on camera, for sure.
Yeah, that was one thing that we always complained about on the Kolchak tapes was invisible monsters. There were so many invisible monsters because it was a lot cheaper.
They're great stories, but I totally know what you mean. And it's almost like the Macho Manito, the reveal of those photographs will assemble is probably the most sort of striking thing of that whole episode, because I guess it's the payoff. And as a fan, you're going, oh, wow, this thing's gigantic. And it's this god, essentially, with this eyeball just staring out of the montage of photos but that's always fun as well when you're thinking about the unseen. And describing those things is always a great challenge as well. And instead of worrying about, I guess it's my love of Jaws. That's my favorite movie. So I love the idea of just slowly eking out the tendrils of something, especially with the first story, having the spectre or the mystery or the antagonist just slowly come into the frame. I'm trying not to spoil things too much in case people are listening, haven't read this or are curious to read it. That's one of my favorite things to do, is that don't show everything all at once. Just do the Jaws thing. Just slowly eke out what the mystery is. And then when there is a reveal, it should be that Brody chumming the water moment. It should be terrifying for the character, for Carl, to be, what is happening? And also for the audience going, oh my goodness, this is actually more terrifying than I expected.
Though Carl is no slouch when it comes to the supernatural, there's a lot of times which, okay, yeah, I've seen this kind of thing before.
And that's exactly right. And I think that was also a motivator. You just poked my brain. I think that it was a big motivator in doing new things, in doing creature or phenomena that is at least a sidestep away from what he's encountered before, just to jar him a little bit, just to have him going, okay, yes, I've I'm no slacker when it comes to seeing horrifying things. But wait a second, this might be on a level that I don't even understand. Because that kind of just refreshes the concept, doesn't it, of the reporter surviving the supernatural.
With you being such a prolific writer, how long did it take you to put this project together?
Let me think, reversing my brain, doing the Wayback Machine. It was all 2023, last year. So I think the last story in the collection, Promises, was probably a couple of months in terms of everything. But from the very start, okay, let's figure out how does this Paris story going to work. The other 4 stories were actually in total around, I'd say, maybe 8 to 10 weeks. They came together pretty quickly. I think because once you're inside that world and that headspace, there's just a fever pitch quality to it. You're going, okay. And I think because the one thing I will say was I was really happy with the Paris story, the final story, which is called Promises. But there's also a problem with that when you go, okay, I've written a quote unquote like spec script for a Kolchak story. And then like an idiot, you pitch doing 4 more. And then you go, well, I want those to be as good as this one, but I feel like I landed this. Is it even possible to do 4 other ones? But I think that was all just good creative fuel to go, they have to be, because I'm my biggest critic. I don't put out any books or music that I don't stand by and say, yes, I think this is of a decent quality. Yeah, I think all that sort of nightmare fuel of failing was just great kinetic fuel to get the thing done. And also because when you are pitching for the stories that have to be so different to the Paris one, for me, that's just creatively very invigorating, because you're going, I have to, as you say, the colors of the rainbow, we have to figure out all these different tones. One note I got was great was from Moonstone, which I completely agree with in terms of there's been so many other great Moonstone adaptation things for Kolchak with comics and prose. But the 2 things I'd say that I really loved the feedback from the first story, which didn't have story notes, but was, yeah, Kolchak works the best when it is scary. This is about essentially a horror mystery genre. It's not comedy. That's not what the character is. That's not the show. But also, Carl has to lead things through the stories that he encounters. If there is a collection, have a kind of palate cleanser, have something that doesn't necessarily have a familiar structure to it. And so the 4th story for me was my kind of the odd story moment, which is called Kindness Can Kill You. And I won't spoil what the story is, but for me, that was a completely different scenario that Carl hadn't encountered before, and just broke the formula of the reporter getting wind of something and investigating something. It's a character being thrown into a situation that he has absolutely no preparation for at all, and is completely stuffed in many respects. And for me, that's just a great writing challenge to go, is that a story? How can you make that an interesting story? And obviously he does survive because he's the protagonist. He's not going to kill off Carl Kolchak. But what is the exit strategy in those kind of scenarios?
That's true too. I didn't even think about that. As far as the tone of those first 2 TV movies is so different than the tone of the TV show. So it definitely felt like you were going more for that horrific tone of those first 2 films.
I wanted the quirky humor to come out of characters interacting, or just Carl's thought processes in terms of when he has that great inner monologue with the voiceover, or we either get a sense of him recording something on a tape recorder from the voiceover motif, or it's just his thought processes. And I think he's such a witty character in terms of the drafts, if you like, of his reporting. But yeah, these situations are, we see Carl terrified or we see Carl wide-eyed, but he's never super confident unless I love the way that when he's cracked a theory, when he thinks, okay, well, maybe this flash is going to work for these aliens, maybe I'm going to try or he has a revelation and he's trying to plead with someone saying, no, this actually is going to help us. This actually is going to solve the situation. But yeah, I enjoyed Moonstone's sort of true north of that, going, don't veer too much into comedy, don't veer too much into other genres that are away from the horror genre, because it really is the beating heart of the show is the monsters, the fear and the disbelief. If he's encountering things which no one else is believing, not even his editor publisher thinks there's a shred of truth to it, that's just a great anchor to keep going down the road of.
Now that you've been in Carl Kolchak's head, do you want to go back? Is there more Kolchak coming out from you?
Nothing planned yet, but I definitely could be tempted. Yes, I think I should again do that thing of saying yes now on the podcast and challenging myself to see whether I could do it another story or collection of short stories. But if it never happens, I'm so thrilled that this exists because, as I say, for what I thought was going to be one story, became a collection of 5 that I'm really proud of, and it's a thrill to hear that you enjoy them. It's always terrifying thinking, please fans know that it's a fan writing them and it's a fan trying to do his best. So if you enjoy them, that's fantastic.
It doesn't feel like fan fiction. It doesn't feel like something I could find on the internet. These are real, actual stories, polished, beautifully paced, super well written. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you, sir. No, can I have that as a pull quote? I'll put that on a poster.
Talking about how prolific you are, what are you working on right now? Because you've got so many different projects that you do.
There is the volume 2 of the X-Files, the official archives, which I'm still busy hard working at. That's been a long project, an ongoing project since the first volume. So that's a really exciting one for me because it's the entire mythology of the X-Files, going back from season 1 all the way through to season 11, presented in a similar way to volume 1 in terms of these are the reports that the agents are filing, with some twists and turns, surprises, should we say, in this particular volume, because when you're handling the mythology of the X-Files, there's a lot of things which can't necessarily be handled as exact reports. There's some other ways to handle those things creatively. Music-wise, I just did a really fun soundtrack for, there's another podcast called Return of the Pod, which is began as a Star Wars-led podcast, but become more of a kind of pop culture podcast. And they wanted a new main theme that expanded to being a bunch of cues and themes for their shows. That was really fun to do because they're great guys. It's a really fun show. And there's a film that's currently in pre-production called Kilter, which I'm attached to as the composer. So that's shooting in about 8 weeks, which is a short, which is basically a proof of concept for a feature, which is a director called Bartley Taylor, who I've worked with before. Great director, great creative. The rest of the year is nice and busy, which is always nice. And I love to be able to balance between books and music projects / film projects because they do inform each other. A lot of people think it's very chalk and cheese, but it's not. They're very much about structure and storytelling and pacing, like you say. And so I think that the more eclectic things that I do just for myself, I feel like it informs the other projects really well and just improves everything.
Where's the best place for people to keep up with you and your work?
Probably the main website is paulterryprojects.com. That sort of has everything covered. So it's just got all of my book work, my music work, and everything in between. You can just figure out, have a click around and see if there's anything that takes your fancy.
Paul, thank you so much. It was great talking with you today.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. I love the show, fan of the show. So it's a great opportunity to be on your show. So thank you.
Chop, chop.